Thank you, Mr. Tan King Lian. So, today again, wages and rightful employment. Do you agree with Mr. Tan King Lian that we should have minimum wage in Singapore? Yes. Then do you agree with Mr. Tan King Lian that we should have unemployment benefits to protect the unemployed in Singapore? Yes. And do you agree that we should shorten national service because it is preventing Singaporean males to be properly employed by employers in Singapore? Yes. Okay. Next up, we do have another speaker, Mr. Vincent Wijeysingha. I always have difficulties pronouncing his name. Mr. Vincent Wijeysingha. Okay. Shall we invite Mr. Vincent? Blah, blah, blah.
After a few drinks, I have problem pronouncing my name, so don't worry about that. Can you hear me? It doesn't seem like there's... Can, right? Okay. Well, being from work fair, and this being a Labour Day event, I was going to talk about labour rights, going to talk about some statistics. But then, you know, Mr. Tan Kin Lian is here, Leong Tze Hian is here, their grasp of the data is going to be much better than mine. And until about 1 o'clock this afternoon, I therefore had no idea what I was going to say to you. What has alarmed me over the last couple of weeks, I have to be honest, is this tide of racism that's suddenly, to me, exploding into a different realm. For example, yesterday or so, there's something called the National Emblems Act. And if you see, for example, a shop with, say, a Mexican restaurant, and they have the flag on it, apparently, according to the Emblems Act, that's illegal. So a certain member of civil society a few days ago went and complained about the Mexican shop and Filipino shop because they had their flags, and therefore, in this person's view, they had contravened the Emblems Act, National Emblems Act. Now, my first thought was, what do you want to achieve by complaining to the government about this? You want to achieve what? That they change the sign because the Filipino flag offends you so much? Or what specifically was the objective? I didn't understand that. And also, then before that, there was that event much publicized here a few days ago, which I found extremely challenging as well. Now, to some extent, I don't know whether the people associated with that event are simply milking this racism. If they are, then they are playing with fire. Because I saw what happened in England for the almost 20 years that I lived there, and certainly for the 40, 50 years before that, the kind of racism that was building in that country, resulting in young people being beaten up, being killed. My cousin was beaten up by a bunch of skinheads. They lived in London from the 1970s, and he was beaten up. He almost died. So, you know, that sort of thing. We may say to ourselves, oh, we Singaporeans are very law-abiding. This is never going to happen here. But each time I get onto a bus and I see a Filipino or a Bangladeshi or a PRC, I know exactly how that person feels, the insecurity. Do you know whether you're going to be seated next to someone who will shout racial epithet at you? Do you know whether when you come down from the bus, there's going to be someone who will do the same, or who will say, fuck off back home? I had that said to me several times. You see it all over the place. Do you know whether you're going to have someone calling you scum, or vermin, or whatever? So I know the feeling that you get from being a foreigner in a foreign country, and that kind of experience. So that's what I want to talk about. And the other worrying problem is when you have, shall we say, opinion formers in Singapore. Online, the online citizen, for example, suggesting that because our feelings, because our rice bowl is threatened, because the impact of the policy is real, therefore this is not xenophobia, therefore this is not racism. To me, that doesn't seem, it seems like a very limited argument. But it also seems like the sort of argument that if I were a government, I would love for the people to have. Because you are doing the government's work for it. Divide and conquer, right? The government doesn't have to come in and keep people separate. Our foolish voters will do it for us. And what's the benefit, what's the effect of it then? We know today or a few days ago that the PM has in his 8 years or so of, 10 years now, right, of being PM earned $28 million. So he sits pretty there with his colleagues and his friends in industry while we are fighting with one another, calling one another names, and then entrenching the kind of problems that we should be working together to solve. So I've been grappling with these issues, and I spoke to Jolovan Wham a few days ago. You know, he runs HOME, the migrant worker NGO. It's been in place for 10 years, I think now, and with the after AWARE, I think HOME is probably one of the most successful NGOs in the country. And I asked him what was his main or key achievement in these last 10 years. And he said to me the achievement was to get the government, MOM, to take migrant workers' rights more seriously and enforce the laws. So the laws, for example, on, you know, when you go home, when your domestic worker goes home, you must pay for the airfare back to her hometown. Those kinds of laws were not being followed, not being enforced. Now they are being enforced. So, in a sense, you could say that what they have achieved in this 10 years is not a great deal, right? They went from -1 to the status quo 0, right? Just to get the government to enforce the law, not even to get the government to bring in better laws. But having reflected on that, and having reflected on the kind of campaigns AWARE has been involved in, for example, the AWARE saga. You remember how they managed to chuck out that deeply unpleasant, homophobic bunch of weirdos who took over AWARE in 2009. And they did it in the same way that HOME has worked, and the people who managed to get Chek Jawa wetlands protected, and these various other successful campaigns, they did it not by wearing teenage ninja scarves around their heads and declaring war on the Philippines and this sort of stuff, which gets into the papers and gets you reported all over the world, but doesn't actually achieve anything. What they did was the patient, persistent, meticulous work that's necessary if you're going to change minds, because policy is about changing minds. It's not about frightening the Filipinos in our midst to go home. It's not about frightening the Bangladeshis and the Chinese to go home. Migrants spend a lot of money to come here, so going home is not an option for them. Dealing with an ugly Singaporean is their problem, not going home. That's not the problem. And it certainly isn't the problem for us to the solution for us to achieve either, because Mr. Leong has done some research, and I think it was published yesterday or the day before, where he says 50.4% of our labor force is foreigners. I challenge anyone, including the people who organized the event that was held here 2 days ago, to tell me if they would be happy for all 50.04% of these people to go home today. This entire nation would collapse were it not for the people who keep our homes, build our buildings. Even the very grass that is cut here are cut by foreigners who earn, let's remember, between $1.20 an hour and $6 an hour. So the issue here is not about shouting and calling people names. The issue is about identifying objectives, long-term objectives for our country as a whole. And those objectives then need to be applied to the correct interlocutor, shall we say, the correct person to receive those objectives. If your objective is to hold up a sign saying, "Fuck off back home, foreigner," you're going to fail, right? Because the foreigners are not going to fuck off back home because a teenage ninja decided to hold up a sign. If, on the other hand, your objective is to remediate the real problems that we Singaporean workers are facing. The rise in the cost of public housing, the rise in the cost of public services, the decline in the services, the quality of our services because of overcrowding, the loss of jobs, particularly by people in their 40s and 50s, the loss of university places to foreigners whom we are attracting here because one of our the ways in which we measure how good our universities are is by the number of foreigners. If we want to remediate these problems, we then have to look at how these problems can be remediated by the people who remediate problems. Who remediates problems in Singapore? Parliament. Who remediates, who gives Parliament the information necessary to be able to make changes if changes are necessary? Who will send more and more opposition candidates into Parliament so that the government cannot kind of steamroll its way through every policy that it wants to achieve? We know, for example, that government has said, the recently promoted Minister for Manpower, the Foreign Minister, the Prime Minister have all said, sorry, not Foreign Minister, the Finance Minister and Prime Minister have all said the migrant labor based industrial policy is not going to change. So if we are confronted with that and we then have to ask ourselves what we are going to do about it, we need to ask ourselves not what they are going to do about it, not what the opposition parties are going to do about it or the NGOs are going to do about it, but every single one of you who is a citizen. Because your citizenship is not something that you are conferred at birth. Your citizenship is something that you earn. And you earn it not by virtue of waving a piece of paper in front of a foreigner. You earn it by virtue of what you have done to improve the community, not just for Singaporeans, but for everybody who lives here. That is how you earn your citizenship. Citizenship is not something you paste on your forehead like we saw some people do on Thursday. Citizenship is what you contribute to make this truly the country you want it to be, I want it to be. So when you go home today, after having heard the speeches, especially the good data-based speeches of Mr. Leong and Mr. Tan, when you go home today, ask yourself whether you are going to go on Facebook and criticize the quality of the event, speculate about how many people were here, criticize Dr. Wijeysingha's foreigners loving speech and say that these people should all leave the country? Or are you going to turn that mirror on yourself? Are you going to ask yourself, what am I doing that will make me worthy of my citizenship? If you look at all the social progress that has been done over the last, let's say, 200 years, all of it was done by ordinary people like us, right? Highly entrenched governments and empires were toppled in the last 200 years by ordinary people. If you then look at how they did it through small little actions, building into greater and greater actions. But it needed people to seize the moment. It needed people to do the hard work that's necessary for this kind of work. And if you flip that coin on its side, you will also realize that the greatest fear that any government ever has is a united people. Now it's fine. Thursday's event, you have one small group fighting with today's event people. Today's event fighting with the migrant worker NGOs. Migrant worker NGOs fighting with so-and-so. That's fine. In the Istana, they sit pretty watching us fight one another. You will watch and see just how frightened they become when our people can start to begin to think about working together, building alliances rather than building walls. All of the, and I'll close with this, all of the rights that we now have, the 8-hour week, the 8-hour day, the 40-hour week, the paid lunch break, paid medical leave, access to training, the banning of child labor, all of these things were won by people, not because they were ninja scarves and shouted slogans, but because they were willing to identify the objective that they wanted, and they were willing then to do the hard graft that achieves those objectives. What can you do? Now, if you think about it, there was a Labour MP from the UK, Tony Benn, some of you may know him. He just died a month and a half ago. He was paraphrasing Gandhi, and he described the process of social struggle. First, he said, when you introduce an idea, like the 8-hour day, or a paid lunch break, they will ignore you. After a while, they will then say you are mad. After a while, they will say it is unworkable. Then there is a pause, and it gains momentum. And by the time it becomes an established and accepted principle, you will not be able to find anyone who doesn't claim to have agreed with the principle when it was first mooted by the people they called mad. That is the process, and that's where we are at the moment. You still have people calling the NGOs mad. Dr. Chee Soon Juan, my good friend and colleague, has been called the most awful names by people for the work that he was doing. Now this is where we are at. But only we can change that. And we can change it in a variety of ways. But the single most important way we will change what needs changing is when we first accept and agree to put people in a place of honor, regardless of their nationality, and work from that point of view. The minute you start to put people in places, in different areas, whether you're foreign, whether you're local, whether you're PR, whether you're woman, man, child, Chinese, Indian, Malay, whatever, you have done the work of the people who would continue to oppress you. And the minute you begin to break down those walls, you have begun to break down the oppression. Thank you very much.